Right? So that's why this introduction session was, it would be very helpful for us. So there are no barriers, we can ask questions. So how we begin is, I just introduce Dr. Amit Goswami to you and invite him and welcome him on stage. And he would deliver his talk, and then we'll keep some time for question answers, right? So that we take full benefit out of it, not that he says and goes. हमारे मन में जो भी questions हैं वो, because he is a scientist with a spiritual bent, so that's a rare combination, right? So I think it would be very helpful for us so that we get enough time to ask questions to him. So I'll invite Madam Sangeeta Nehra, Nimrit, Oshan, Dr. Shaveta. Please welcome Dr. Goswami with a bouquet. Arun Ratsuji, please come. Welcome, Mr. Sinha.
Everyone, please stop.
For the photo.
Thank you.
And in one of his seminar books, The Self-Aware Universe, he solved the quantum measurement problem, elucidating the famous observer effect while paving the path to a new paradigm of science based on the primacy of consciousness. Even I don't understand all this, I admit, right? But he would explain. And subsequently, in the visionary window, Sir demonstrated how science and spirituality could be integrated. And there is another book, Physics of the Soul. And I possess this book, And he developed a theory of survival after death and reincarnation. So which is again a very interesting subject. And there's another book, Quantum Creativity. It's a tour de force instruction about how to engage in both outer and inner creativity. And in another book, The Quantum Doctor, integration of conventional and alternative medicine is discussed about. And in Creative Evolution, he presented a resolution between Darwinism and the intelligent design of life. And there is another book, The God is Not Dead. He asserted that not only are science and religion compatible, but that quantum physics proves the existence of God. And in Quantum Creativity, he explained all facets of creativity, its definition, quantum thinking it entails, and what it is required to be creative. And another book is Quantum Mechanics, Quantum Economics, and another recent book, the Everything Answer book, is he tells about basic premise that quantum physics is not only the future of science, but it is also the key to understanding consciousness, death, God, psychology, and the meaning of life. And so recognizing a widespread need to implement the solutions presented by quantum physics to global crises in economics, politics, education, environment, healthcare. So Dr. Goswami and his team, they have launched Quantum Activism Vishwalyam. And so this is a transformative institution of higher learning. This is based out of Jaipur, India, and which will offer students primarily online postgraduate level transformational training in consciousness and the quantum worldview with an emphasis on quantum living and the exploration of wholeness in their professional pursuits. So now this work is being done on a much larger scale, and so education and training also is available under his guidance. So I welcome you, sir, and we feel honored to have you here, and so you took out your time and made all the efforts to travel here to be with us today. And so, sir, the stage is all yours. Please enlighten us. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Good morning.
Good morning.
title was originally planned, I think, by you, Sachin. I don't know what motivated you. Anil, physics of the soul. From hearing what the audience is, would you mind if I change the title to a general appraisal of where quantum worldview, it is giving us a new worldview. That's the important message. Worldview that integrates science and spirituality. This is a very important subject. Physics of the soul is very important too. I mean, the incarnation is something we all covet, and the incarnation has very important message for our psychology and human development, and indeed it plays a very large role in the education that we are offering at the Quantum Activism Vishalayam. But having said all that, really the very important thing about quantum science is that finally we have a way of dealing with consciousness. We don't even know. I mean, however much we say consciousness is a brain phenomena or brain can cognize, all this everybody knows, including the people who propagate these ideas, that they're false. They cannot be. Why? For a simple reason. Newtonian physics was constructed as a physics of objects. And indeed, the material world is mostly about objects. And so consciousness does not enter, and we have gotten away with having a science of objects for so long because we have dealt with mainly material objects. Now it turns out that the objects of consciousness self, those single cell creatures, their behavior too become largely just this old and just this conditioned, and therefore can be predicted, except for a few things. Few things like what is the difference between living and non-living. So those questions have been warning materialist scientists for a long time that something you are missing. But the reason they cannot respond, or they do not respond, is that it is impossible to respond within the scientific approach that people have taken. And look, this is quite reasonable. I mean, you develop a scientific approach, and that is something, and most people would agree that something is better than nothing. Before, we have only philosophy to guide us. Although, in India, we would like to think that the mystics were more than philosophers. They really did experience very expanded state of consciousness. But other people in other areas of the world don't have the advantage of having such great people in our midst, even in the 20th century, and I hope even continuing in the 21st century, although I cannot name a name which belongs to this century particularly. But in 20th century, ample names, 19th century, ample names of great people who seem to have direct experience of very expanded states of consciousness, from which they even could demonstrate that they had expanded states of consciousness. So in this way, it is important to talk about consciousness. Since we human beings operate on both very low levels of consciousness, conditioned being, and very high level of consciousness, working with these mystics. And majority of people work sort of at the middle level, where they use something new and something old, as I said. That's the being. The material being can only explain the completely conditioned old being. Everything is based on the brain, means one thing only. Brain has conditioned circuits, memories, and on that basis, yes, I can live my life on that basis to a substantial extent. To that extent, materialist science describes me fairly well. Cognitive behavioral psychology medicine, allopathic medicine, behavioral medicine, these things are adequate to deal with the problems I develop in terms of disease, and they can be used for healing techniques. But whenever something new is required, and society and evolution is such that new things always enter the fray. So what is happening right now, as you already know, and I'm really delighted to participate in an event of the Quantum Healing Institute. This is what needs to happen everywhere. Look at what is happening. These guys established their healing institute, surely being aware that allopathic medicine is just completely inadequate to deal with chronic disease. Chronic disease arises from mental stress. And mental stress is really a mental phenomenon in ways that although it starts from the conditioned mind, but it requires a new solution. You cannot solve a problem of conditioned mind without bringing creativity in it. Einstein made a statement like that a long time ago. You cannot solve a problem within the context that created the problem. And that's a very basic statement to remember. Most important problems cannot be solved within the paradigm that gave rise to the problem. So we have cancer, we have heart disease, we have epidemic of depression today, and now the newest, of course, everybody knows is dementia. And nobody has any idea of how to deal with these things with the old systems of medicine. Now, of course, I'm talking about a crisis, but crisis is important for society. Without crisis, we cannot seem to change. And now that the crisis is over, I think people are looking at quantum physics because quantum physics gives us in a very strange way. Nobody expected this. But it does introduce consciousness in a very definitive way that can be verified scientifically. And this is, I just cannot express how important this is. You know, today people have been so mesmerized by the European-American success of explaining things and giving us technology that we all like and enjoy. But if we are not so diverted by the technology and the success, then it is very clear that worldview is important. How we look at things determines the way we live. And the way we live determines the way the society is. So one of the things that is very important to recognize that we as Indians, we got our freedom in 1947 from a physical domination by Europeans, but we are not free yet. This is very important. This is why, although we are only 40 or 50 in number over here, but it is so important for you to recognize that what you are starting here is nothing short of a freedom movement again. This, I'm talking about intellectual freedom. We are still slaves of the American Eastern Seaboard of framing how our world is. And this is patently false. The world is material movement caused by material interaction. This idea is patently false. Absolutely false. Demonstrably false, and has been demonstrated, and scientists know it. It is ultimate hypocrisy that this science is not only propagandized by these people, but they have managed by their publicity, gimmicks, and internet and all this to convince such a large number of intelligentsia all over the world. Europe is a small continent, you know, it's just, well, fourth largest continent, I guess, larger now, maybe not even larger than Australia. And their thinking still dominates the world, they and their descendants. This has to change. This has to change not because we are fighting for our independence, not because of that. Ideas don't belong to any particular group. They indeed belong to everybody. So it's nothing wrong with taking ideas which are right for another part of the world. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is taking wrong ideas only leads to a wrong society. This has to be understood very deeply. So let me go back to the subject and talk about quantum physics. What is in it that gives you the idea of consciousness? From the get-go, quantum physics has this problem and agreed to understand this problem in a deep way, you have to sit down and really read the experiments, definitions, what things are, and ponder, and then only total understanding will dawn. So in a short lecture, you have to take some things by faith, and my statements, I'll make them pretty concise. Try to see the difference, and then you will get it, I think, the basic. All you need to get is the basic. From the get-go, quantum physics started with the idea that energy consists of elementary particles, and they called it quantum to differentiate them from the elementary particles of matter. Elementary particles means a very simple idea. Objects can be broken down only to an ultimate building block. Like a building is made of bricks, similarly matter is made of these elementary particles, which cannot be broken down any further. And then the idea came that energy, which seems like very continuous, energy after all is connected with my movement. I mean, it's incredible that the movement, I mean, okay, the hand can be broken down in molecules, but movement, that seems like continuously changeable, right? So the idea indeed was very strange, that the movement itself, the energy that is changing by continuous, what seems to be continuous movement of the hand, that movement itself consists of elementary objects that cannot be broken down any further, seemed like a strange concept. But that is pale in front of the real implication of this idea. And the real implication is that light is a form of energy, and yet light is not only an elementary particle, but light has been known already when this idea was proposed. Light has been known for a couple of 100 years to be wave, to be a wave. You get a completely different concept. Now, our ordinary knowledge of wave comes from looking at water waves, especially waves in the ocean. Now, forget waves in the ocean, but simple water wave, like a raindrop falling on a pond and gives you these crest lines that expand and expand. What does that tell you? A crest line is describing a large circle on the pond, and the wave is everywhere on that crest line. You can verify this. You put a cork on the crest line, and everywhere, if you put corks, all the corks will be bobbing up and down, a little bit sideways. So, this is a very strange thing. No, very, very strange thing. Waves are everywhere, more than one place at a time. Whereas particles, this requires no much intelligence. Particles always can be only one place at a time. Waves are everywhere, and particles can only be at one place at a time. Think about it. How is that possible? Does not seem to be possible. So at that time, there was a crisis of thinking. how to think about quantum physics if this is the case. And if you go back to history, you find people just panicking and making all kinds of assertions and stuff. And gradually a compromise emerged. Typically, behavior of ostriches, not the real problem was solved, but compromises were developed, which maintains the worldview that there is only objects. But complete compromise was impossible. There were still words that were used that were telling people that the story is not complete. I'll give you an example. If you read Niels Bohr's work, for example, you will see that he says, well, okay, this behavior is complementary. However, there is a place where we should be disturbed a little bit. It's very weird behavior. Wave and particle are complementary behaviors, but what experiment we choose to determine the object will behave like a wave or behave like a particle is up to us. So there is an effect of the observer. And then later on, another scientist named John von Neumann, I mention his name because he should get a lot of credit for introducing consciousness in the affair. He pointed out what's really weird. What's really weird is that the only way to understand these waves is to say that the waves are possible waves. They're not really waving in space and time. That's impossible. Let's just face what is impossible and call a spade a spade. So he said the right thing. The waves are really waves of possibility. They are not waving in space and time. They are waving in a domain outside of space and time. And then the strange thing is the observer effect. A human observer wants to look at these waves of possibility, and by that intention of looking, and he's presenting an apparatus to help him to look, because after all these objects are very, very small. I have to amplify them in order to look. So I take an amplifying apparatus and then look like a photographic film, and lo and behold, the object reveals itself as a particle. As soon as you measure it, the wave of possibility becomes a particle because an observer is looking. Okay, everybody getting this? This is the fundamental thing that you have to understand. This is called observer effect. The observation is making waves of possibility of quantum physics into particles. Now, what you have to notice that already the worldview has changed. Already the worldview has changed, although no scientific materialist will acknowledge it. Why the worldview has changed? Because waves of possibility don't exist in space and time. They cannot. There is no possibility in space and time. Is this table a possible table? No, it is actual. I'm seeing it. As soon as I have experienced something, it becomes actual. There is no possibility in experience. We can think about possibilities, but they don't manifest as possibilities. They cannot. And no electron has ever manifested in more than one position. So that being the case, we are already acknowledging that there is another domain of reality, not just this space and time. Scientific materialism is based on the fundamental idea that there is only space and time. And therefore, they have been saying for 400 years that the mystical, spiritual way of looking at things, which always proposed that there is another domain of reality, more perfect, which can be called heaven in English, and in India we call it Brahman, and then this domain of reality, where there is separateness. This wisdom is also a basic worldview that lasted until the modern science came along about 400 years ago. This is the spiritual religious worldview. Agreed, the religious worldview became very skewed because of introduction of many secondary and sometimes basically wrong ideas, like God as an emperor sitting on a throne in heaven. So these are problems. But if you forget the problems, if you go back to the original teachings, then this idea that there is another domain of reality which is more perfect, which is a oneness. That's the best way of defining it. I'll get to the word a little later. But think of it, what quantum physics is saying. It's finally saying that yes, there is such a domain. Is it a oneness? So three other scientists, Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, they became very famous for their paper in 1935, where they showed that indeed in this domain, if two objects interact together, coming together and applying a force on each other, they don't have to necessarily touch, just have to come close together, then there is interaction. And this Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen showed that if two objects interact like that in quantum physics, they become one. They never put it that way. What they said is that if they are able to communicate without exchanging signal, and then you have to understand what that means. You have to ask the question, who do I know that I communicate without exchanging signal? Who do you know? You don't know anybody except you. We can only communicate with ourselves without exchanging signal. So if two objects can communicate without exchanging signal, the two are not two, they are one. Oneness. So the same concept that the mystics were creating some 5,000 to 7,000 years ago in India, and then propagated all over the world and became the basis of the spiritual religious worldview that still exists. 50% of the world still believe in that worldview. It's not completely just Amit Goswami speaking it, or a few quantum physicists speaking it. We do have that half of the world who implicitly support this worldview. So in this way, quantum physics became already an anathema for materialist thinking, that there is only matter in space and time. Now what is very important, I mentioned von Neumann before, let's go back to that a little and see that von Neumann made a statement, but he did not take it completely, just as Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen missed the idea that two objects communicating instantly means that two objects are one. Similarly, von Neumann also missed the point that if the observer is essential for bringing the possibility into actuality, then the question can be asked, where is the observer? Where is the observer? Von Neumann is assuming that the observer is separate from what he is looking at. But of course, if you think about it, observer is also a material body with a brain and all that. And since they are made of quantum possibilities, they must also be just possibilities. So a possible observer is looking at a possible object, right? That's the actual situation. Possible observer looking at possible object, giving you an actual observer and actual object. This is what is actually happening, right? When you put it that way, it becomes very clear that there must be a domain of reality in which only potentialities exist, possibilities exist, waves of possibility, and a possibility of oneness. And that oneness, possibility of oneness, in which possible subject and possible object exist. And then an intention arises, and that intention of seeing myself separately from myself creates this subject-object split. I went a little bit fast, I think, so let me straight this again. There is oneness. right? And there's this intention of observing. Intention is a very scientific intention. Don't make it into a God's play and all this. We don't need that. We can strictly make it a scientific proposition. Scientific intention. The possible observer wants to see the possible object, just as we do. And then that intention brings about the actual subject looking at the actual object. And because von Neumann missed all this, although he did his work in the 1950s, another 40 years or so had to pass before it came to me, and I finally realized that the solution is to assume the reality, that oneness is becoming subject and object in the process of quantum measurement. And this then becomes the quantum worldview. Why? Because you are starting with oneness. You are starting with oneness, which in India we call it Brahman, but a much more scientific name would be consciousness. Why? Because subject-object, which is we call awareness, chit in Sanskrit, that is arising from that consciousness. In India, the idea is Brahman is splitting into chit, subject and object. Now we are giving an English name to Brahman, and consciousness is a very good translation. Okay? In this way, we now have a different worldview. The worldview that scientific materialists give, I already said, does not work because objects can never give you a subject that looks at objects. That should be logically very clear without any argument, and indeed even materialists would accept that. But they won't, of course, accept the solution. Now look at what happened with quantum physics. One last word about quantum physics. The problem of quantum physics and why quantum measurement theory, this theory that von Neumann started and I completed, why it is not so popular and palatable, is that most scientists work with technology based on physics and chemistry. And there one can get by with the idea of possibility waves and never have to consider the actualization of possibility. The measurement problem just doesn't enter because you're always dealing with large number of objects. Therefore, the idea of probability can be introduced, and indeed quantum physics has to connect to the experimental data of the macro world of molecules and atoms. And so the design of quantum physics is such that for large number of objects, these probabilities can be predicted by quantum physics. So it is possible to get by with probabilities which can be calculated from quantum physics and give you very accurate prediction about large number of objects that physics and chemistry and technologies deal with, and completely ignore the fundamental problem of what happens to a single quantum object. How does it become is a wave, as the equations of quantum physics declares flatly without any ambiguity. This is the problem that never makes into important discussion for physics and chemists. This is the problem. In biology, it enters, but biology, as you know, we already have fragmented, again, the European tradition. India was never like this, but in Europe, they did it. They fragmented knowledge into various fields, and then these fields become absolute. I remember when I first formulated, back in 1989, these new ideas, oft asked question would be challenged by physicists. Why are you bringing an idea of psychology? To them, consciousness is an idea of psychology, to physics to solve a physics problem. And if I speak to psychologists or biologists, then biologists and psychologists say, so that is a problem of quantum physics. How can we understand quantum physics? So don't talk to us. In this way, everybody was avoiding talking about consciousness because nobody knew how to place consciousness in the compartmentalization that we had. A very weird situation because consciousness should be everywhere. These are, after all, human endeavors. But paradoxes and paradoxes and paradoxes is what the consequence of wrong hypothesis in the beginning one should expect, right? So, in spite of all this difficulties, quantum science did continue. Not very many people participated in it, and now finally the things are changing. And this is why I'm here. This is why what this group is doing is so important. This is why this interested integration of science and spirituality is so important. And this is why I'm so enthused that you have come to listen to this morning's lecture. So very, very quickly, let me tell you the amount of wisdom, amount of wisdom our ancestors presented to us. In the Upanishad itself, and then later on I'll comment on two other books, Bhagavad Gita and Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. But look at just the Upanishads themselves. How many of you have at least have a cursory idea of what Upanishads are? If you have read a popular book on Upanishads, please raise your hand. Just to get an idea. That's all? That's still very small. How many of you know that Upanishads exist, or Vedanta? Oh, that's good. You see, this is a problem, huge problem today. We have forgotten our ancestry. How many of you know about, oh, okay, this you don't know either. How many of you know about Democritus or Aristotle? Aristotle? Okay. Okay, those are the guys of the other side, scientific materialism. Okay, so that's pretty equal. We haven't read Aristotle either, so it's pretty evenly divided. We don't treat philosophy today. We'd rather check the internet, and if you check the internet, you get very little about Vedanta. You don't get it as the way that I'm going to represent it. Vedanta is enormous. It is so enormous, it's undescribably satisfying to quantum scientists. Because almost every idea of quantum science we can see in origin in Vedanta. You will say, how could this happen? How could 5,000 to 7,000 years ago people could philosophize about this? And the answer is they didn't philosophize. They didn't philosophize. They saw the world like this. This is why it is very important to not to separate science and experience anymore. We are talking about science of experience. The reason that I invite everyone to transform, what I found, the reason that I could understand these things the way I did and others could not, which were, frankly, I am a very ordinary human being. I never lose sight of that. An ordinary human being, ordinary intelligence could understand these things better than super duper intelligent beings of Harvard and Princeton. The reason is very simple. Those guys never had any experience of expanded consciousness. They really don't. I have talked with Nobel laureate physicists. I had discussion with Eugene Wigner, Chen-Ning Yang, and several other lesser scientists, but Nobel laureates. I mention these two because they really are great physicists. But even they do not have any idea of what expansion of consciousness means. Scientists live in a world which is totally intellectual and mathematical to a large extent, which is the ultimate of confusing logic. Mathematical logic is so perfect, If your basic assumption is right, mathematical logic gives you such infallible answers that you get an idea that you don't need anything else. Just logic, just the basic assumption, forgetting that where are the basic assumptions going to come from? Suppose the basic assumptions are wrong. That one supposition that the basic assumption could be wrong and often is, can get you astray completely, although mathematical logic is logic as perfect as can be, infallible logic. But this infallibility has fooled a very large number of people. How long? I do not know. Nobody can predict. Of course, this is why we are having the crisis, and sooner or later, a large number of people, starting with this 50 here, large number of people are going to come to realize that a solution can be obtained, a better solution, if we let consciousness in, and quantum physics is already giving us the way to do it. This is how the paradigm shift or worldview change is going to eventually come to us. So in what areas will it come? It won't come in physics and chemistry. Don't look at physics, chemistry, engineering, technology. If those things were not predictable, if those things had quantum movement, life would be impossible. You walk on a bridge and the bridge starts quantum movement. No, that kind of life we don't want. So we better have stable structures. I'm sitting on stable structures. I don't want this to have quantum movement. I want this to be solid support. I don't want to have any deviation from that. Everybody is like that. We want a solid support on which to base ourselves. But then we also want creativity. We also want creativity. Our health needs creativity. Health is a balance of creativity and conditioning. As the Chinese found out a long time ago, I hear there's plenty of Ayurvedic physicians or Ayurvedic students here. They know that health is dynamic. You cannot have a good model of health if you assume only conditioned beings. Constantly needs new prana, new vital energy. We have now many different subjects like health, like psychology, and if I can, business. This one is a little bit curious how business can have applications from newness or creativity, because we have become used to thinking of business as principles that are established and standard. No, it's not like that. Business has become moribund if you don't bring in new technologies and innovations, just as right now. This is a big problem all over the world. Nobody has any new ideas, and the old ideas are not enough. They're not working. But I'll come to that later, and time may not permit me at all, because I do want to answer your questions. So let me quickly go over the kind of problems that psychology and healing medicine suggests that the new science can solve. Now, one idea, I mentioned Upanishads before, and I literally feel joyful whenever I mention this. The Upanishads already had this idea, and on the basis of that same creativity and intuition that the original rishis could fathom, expansion of consciousness is basic. That expanded consciousness is from where the world comes about. And then they also gave us the idea that the expansion of consciousness reveals itself progressively in 5 different ways. The consciousness which is very, very constricted, in that form it is matter. Possibilities of consciousness that becomes very constricted in the way that it works. Only at the very microscopic level they are quantum, but micro makes up macro. The more macro it becomes, the more predictable the behavior becomes. I'll call it Newtonian, because Newton predicted this behavior some 400 years ago. So let it be. This is the basic level. Today we call this basic level as hardware. Computer language is very convenient. We call it hardware. Hardware is where we have to build our ideas. Consciousness builds its ideas on the basis of hardware. Just as we build our computers, hardware, and then we put ideas on it, similarly, consciousness has this scientific proposition, let there be matter, and matter is the hardware. And the ancient people realized it. And then they immediately realized that the hardware needs something in order to have life, and they called it prana, vital energy. That's how the English translation is. Immediately people get very confused because the word energy has been monopolized by physics. You'll be surprised, only since 1837. But this European-American conglomerate is so powerful that they really take over something. So the word energy, although all through the human history, the word energy has been used by all different languages in different forms, just not in the English language. English language it has been used also, but sporadically. 18th century poet William Blake, quite famous, he wrote the line, energy is eternal delight. 18th century. The idea of energy in physics came about in 1837, 19th century, 100 years later. How could Blake be talking about physical energy? So what is Blake talking about? Energy is eternal delight. He's talking about prana. He's talking about chi. Chinese discovered it a little bit later than the Upanishads. But the idea is that without prana, you cannot have living being. Living being is defined by consciousness and prana. You already have something which is software. Living being has to live. That requires software. So prana is software imposed on hardware. It's the movement of the software that we experience as prana, living software. And then the Upanishad says there is another, even superior software, that is the mental software, movement of mind, connection with the brain. That is the final software that we have. But they fathom that beyond the software capacity that we have, there is the idea of the software. Vijnana. Jnana means knowledge. Vijnana means that which gives you the context of knowledge. They said that this realm of Vijnana, from which context of knowledge comes from, context of the software making comes from. Both mind, intention, and vital energy come from that domain. And then they said that, of course, these whole four bodies, this Anandamaya Kosha, the physical body, Pranamaya Kosha, the vital body, Manomaya Kosha, the mental body, Vijnanamaya Kosha, the supramental body, all are contained in a body they declared. How wonderful, just imagine, and you should be thrilled. They called it Anandamaya Kosha, body of Ananda. Now the word Ananda still exists in Hindi, in Bengali, in most Indian languages. I think even the South Indians kept it, Ananda. Ananda is a very specific Indian word. You don't find the word Ananda in any other language in the fullest extent that Ananda implies. Ananda, the word comes from Ananta. Ananta, anta means boundary, ananta means no boundaries. Ananda is the joy of existing in a state of no boundary. I was talking about expansion of consciousness. Imagine an expansion of consciousness without any boundary, whichever way. This is the wisdom from which the ancient Indians, our ancestors, these very people sitting, we have the same genes still flowing in our body, in our brain. Imagine this. They experienced this Ananda to the fullest extent, and from which they declared that yes, the entire world arises from this Anandamaya Kosha. How amazing is that? If you are not thrilled to know this, I can't imagine what would thrill you. How amazing is this idea? That we all come from that unlimited expansion of consciousness that is the ground of all being, ground of all experiences. This idea existed 5,000 to 7,000 years ago in India, and India only until another some 4,000 or 5,000 years later, we find the idea to be to have originated also in China, in Greece, and eventually in the Midwest, which Mid-East, which of course got very famous through the work of Jesus Christ. Okay, but all that is history. All that is history. That's not going to revive any glory for India, how much as you wish it, because as I said, ideas are completely shareable. Ideas don't belong to any group or culture, just as Western ideas of science belongs to us as much as the Indian ideas of Vedanta belongs to Westerners and every human being everywhere in the world, and it should be that way. However, I'll say this. Now that we know that we are made of 5 bodies, we have a responsibility of creating our society. Now that we know that not only quantum physics, quantum science is recapturing the idea, making it scientific, but these ideas started and formed the basis of our society. Agreed, it had many faults because we could not understand all the different ramifications of these ideas. We made mistakes. Every human society made mistakes. But mistakes are only to be forgiven. Let's forget and forgive the mistakes and see the profundity of these ideas. And the reason what you are doing is so important, and the reason that integration of science and spirituality that so many of you are interested in is so important is because of this. There are many, many good ideas that are also developed in the interim. It is not just Vedanta. Look at Vedanta developed 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. And then a major development came in the form of the Bhagavad Gita. And that, by no estimate, would be any earlier than 3,500 years ago or so. Correct? Anil? So many eons went by, right? More than 2,000 years went from Upanishads to Bhagavad Gita. So what happened in the interim? We do not know. There is not much history. My guess is that the ideas were experiencing some challenges. One of the problems with the ideas were that if reality is oneness, and if the separateness that we experience as subject looking at object, and the idea of more than one subject because there are different brains and every brain would have its own subject and then objects to see. This too is a natural consequence, and what I have said before, software and conditioning, known behavior, that is essential part of being human, and therefore everyone would have an ego based on this known behavior, in addition to that subject that arises from the oneness, which we will call Antaratman in Sanskrit, but let's call it quantum self to make it more scientific sounding. So the net effect of this world is that the world is so divided, right? So the wisdom then that developed is very tragic. Wisdom that developed in India or elsewhere also, this continued very misleading. And we have to recognize, as Bhagavan Sri Rajneesh or Osho used to say, that the world was miserable to live in those times. It was not very pleasant, even in India. The weather was good, but still, I mean, Chandigarh is cold, let's face it, right? Can you imagine being homeless in Chandigarh, even in Chandigarh? I mean, this is not very cold, it's not as cold as Alaska, but still, can you imagine being homeless even in this city? I mean, it's hard. And this is what the point is. The point is that people who were growing up in the Indus Valley, even in this good weather, most of the year, they had to deal with this winter, and there was no answer to winter, except what cost money, getting fuel, getting fire. So therefore, people bought this idea that this world of separateness is meaningless, let's go for the unity. The definition of spirituality became this. This is the biggest tragedy that India has suffered. This is also a tragedy that the rest of the world suffered. The West recovered early from this tragedy by the development of modern science. And of course, we were, unfortunately, we were already under the Mughal emperors, and then the British took over, and we never got the chance of looking at it ourselves once again. That are there different ideas in the Hindu tradition than this one idea? One idea that was idea of Vedanta, which was taken over also by Buddhism. The idea that the world is nothing, only expansion brings you happiness, expansion of consciousness. The idea was right there with us. 3,500 years ago, a great guy named Krishna came about, and he had a whole bunch of people who helped him in establishing another idea, a very different idea. Krishna says very clearly in the Bhagavad Gita that, okay, this is the basic idea. You read chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita, please, everyone should read it. That very clearly, no ambiguity. Yes, this worldview is the right worldview, and yes, it seems right that this is all secondary to that oneness. It's all this separateness. Indeed, this is not the basic reality. And indeed, it is true that we should all, at some point, find out about the basic reality. But he also says at the same time that that is not the objective of you. He's talking to Arjuna, his favorite disciple. For you, there is right now the problem of the world, how to fight this war. And you are trying to avoid the problem of the world by bringing up the idea of what the ultimate objective is. Keep that as the ultimate objective. But of course, we are born again and again. The phenomenon of reincarnation is also part of Vedanta. We are born again and again. Eventually, as a stage comes in which we seek that oneness. You have to do your duty. You have to carry on what Krishna called Dharma, which is a concept already introduced in the Vedanta, which is in modern language. You follow using a language of Plato, which is more appropriate. You follow your archetype. And with some help from civilization all across the world and the way our professions are, we now can signify 9 archetypes other than this archetype of self, which is what Indians traditionally pursue as spirituality. Bhagavad Gita was the first clear statement that there is another archetype that you can follow other than self and still be completely spiritual. What is being completely spiritual mean to you? Complete spirituality, as the Chinese also recognized early on, complete spirituality means just this one thing, what I started with. a balance between conditioning and creativity. If we could live our life in such a way that I'm talking to you on the basis of ideas that my conditioned brain gives you, but I'm thrilled with what I'm talking to. I'm inspired with what I'm talking to. Where does that inspiration come from? The inspiration could only come from that expansion of consciousness. And if I can behave this way, why can't you? Of course you can, and you do some of the time. As the Upanishad said, you sons and daughters of the immortals, why do you believe in this so much mortality and so much limited? You don't need to. It is so easy. And now it has become even more easy than the times of Bhagavad Gita, because quantum science has given us a science of creativity. A scientific basis of how to reignite this inspired way of living. It is with us always. This is the other stuff that the Bhagavad Gita emphasizes. Krishna is with us always. No Arjuna has to suffer from lack of guidance. It's a quantum self which guides us. But we have to look for it. We have to be sensitive to it. That sensitivity is all. How to be sensitive is also very clear. Get out of this idea of mathematics, rationality, giving us correct answers. They can't, because the basic assumptions are wrong, on which mathematics can be carried out. There is no mathematics for consciousness. This is a safeguard that basic science already has. If there were mathematics for consciousness, then there would be no creativity in the world. In quantum terms, the potentialities, possibilities would never manifest into actuality if that were the case. In other words, there would be never any actual world of experience if mathematics ruled the world. Give up this devotion to mathematics and intellectuality and get the idea of real freedom. Real freedom means also freedom from logic. Real freedom also means listening to your emotions, listening to love, listening to feelings. And only when we bring these ideas do we have proper science of psychology, proper science of mental health, even proper science of physical health, as these guys will tell you. I think one of you mentioned love and you made me so proud. What we find is so strange from a scientific materialist point of view. The answer to cancer is love. I'm literally telling you the truth. Some data by an Indian doctor shows that indeed bereaved women who mourn for their beloved husbands passing forever and ever, partly by social constraint, partly by mental grief, genuine grief. And what happens is their heart chakra becomes very constricted, completely devoid of love. And indeed, these women have much greater incidence of breast cancer than any other segment of women. The explanation is very simple. If love comes back in these women's life, then healing can occur. And healing can occur so fast. Deepak Chopra has named this healing quantum healing before even he was aware of a full quantum science. But it is the correct name. The creative process leads to creative insight with such a force. The immune system comes back to life again with such a force that overnight the breast cancer can go away. And we are seeing this kind of thing. We have begun to see, my collaborator Sunita Patani, she is using the quantum methods in her psychological practice in London, and she repeatedly finds that if creativity is used with psychoanalysis or any other form of therapy, therapy becomes so much more powerful. So this idea of quantum healing alone is so powerful in terms of giving us new directions in medicine. But quantum science does much more than that. We already have the tradition of Ayurveda. We already have homeopathy tradition based on the idea of prana. Quantum science does absolutely fantastic in terms of explaining prana as a purely quantum energy. And now that we have explanation of prana, we have also methods of finding solid experimental evidence and technology of prana. So I'll finish. Okay, I'm going 5 minutes over, but you will forgive me. And then I'll open up for questions. I'll finish with 3 different experiments because these experiments really are very conclusive. The first experiment is purely material experiment. This guy, Alain Aspect, a French physicist, with 2 other collaborators, they did this fantastic definitive experiment in 1982. Believe it or not, 1982, so long ago. This amazing materialist establishment of Harvard and Princeton and other Eastern Seaboard I call it American intellectual imperialism, much more powerful than British imperialism ever was. This American intellectual imperialism is so powerful. Imagine this, in 1982, Alain Aspect demonstrated that there indeed exists a domain of potentiality in which 2 objects can interact and become one. They can communicate instantly. In 1994, I was fortunate to help, and therefore my name was put on this paper, but I had nothing to do with the experiment. The experiment was done by Jacobo Greenberg and his collaborators. And the experiment shows that 2 brains, if they meditate together with the intention that they will be one, they become one. The demonstration was that their communication between the 2 brains become spontaneous without requiring any signal. Investigate the brain. So they had to be satisfied with just collecting brain waves, and that's how Greenberg did his experiment with brain waves. That's good, but limited. What the brain scientists discovered now is that they have imaging machines, and these machines, MRI, magnetic resonance imaging techniques, is revolutionizing neuroscience. If you combine the imaging technique with a measurement of blood flow in different parts of the brain, which also can be done in a non-invasive way, then you have a wonderful technique called functional MRI. As you are imaging the different parts of the brain, you can also tell which parts are functioning by measuring the blood flow. Simple measurement, right? But this simple measurement can give us the wonders of 2 kinds of activities that we engage in. And indeed, these people found that when people engage in ordinary activities, such as listening to a lecture, then indeed every brain goes into a mode which would partially be listening to the speaker, the working mode, and the brain is incapable of being in the working mode all the time. So when it's not in the working mode, it falls into the default mode. And where does it go in the default mode? They call it the self-agency area. It vegetates in the self-agency area. It's a very limited area of the brain, situated right behind your forehead, called the prefrontal cortex. Very simple to visualize. We can call it the site of the ego if you wish. But then, more research showed that this is not the entire story. When people have creative experiences, even when people have a strong experiences of an external signal, the brain behaves in a completely different way. brain becomes much more what is quantum physics we call non-local. This one place we call local. Non-local is different places active at the same time. And communicating in synchrony. The quantum language is coherence. Communicating with phase synchrony, like a symphony orchestra is almost like that. In symphony orchestra, the mystery is, of course, the conductor who is moving his baton, and that's how musician here knows how to keep in sync with the musician over there, right? No mystery there. That the mystery is there. Mystery is that the speed of light is so high that the synchrony is almost complete. In the brain, there is no speed of light communication. In the brain, the neurons communicate with very ordinary speeds. So you cannot maintain synchrony between a part of the brain which is inside the brain, like the amygdala in the midbrain, and the neocortex in that way. But a conscious experience often involves the hippocampus, a near close neighbor of amygdala in the midbrain, and the prefrontal cortex in the top layer of the brain, and that's pretty much a couple of inches of distance, and that would take time to communicate between. And so this is a huge dilemma of the neuroscientist. How can the brain become so active that one part here and one part in the middle, one part in the side, one part in the back of the occipital cortex? How can all these things simultaneously be working in synchrony, or maybe even in coherence, like we say in quantum physics? Actually dancing in phase, like dancers dance while they perform a chorus line. Imagine this. And then the plot thickens. This is the latest discovery. That if people meditate for 30 to 40 years, every day, couple of hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, there are people such as this, you know. There are still spiritual people, believe it or not. Lots of them, actually. And their brains were studied. These two guys, Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson in America, they studied these people. They wrote a book, Altered Traits. These people's brains change so completely that their brain is more or less acting in this kind of synchrony all the time. All the time. Where do they live? They live in that Anandamaya Kosha that I'm talking about, that I was talking about. These are not imaginations of a few quasi-mad people sitting in Himalayas 5,000 to 7,000 years ago and seeing delusions. No. These are real intuitions of real people who experience these experiences that even now people can live it. Of course, they have to make some effort. The effort does not have to be meditation for so long. Effort can be practical, effort can be creative, effort can be very conducive to our ordinary life, as the message of Bhagavad Gita is. The final word that I'll say, final sentence, is that, even creativity. I took some pride because I developed the science of creativity in quantum science, and that is indeed a good accomplishment, I think. But then I read Patanjali's Yoga Sutra very carefully, and this great rishi, and believe it or not, nobody knows when he existed. It may be 2,400 years ago, it may be 2,000 years ago, but this guy had it all. In the book Yoga Sutra, if you understand it correctly, the creative process that we now have scientifically described and explained and empiricists have verified this for quite some time. This guy Patanjali, so long ago, enunciated this, except the language is obscure. But if you understand the language, you really realize, oh my God, these ancestors of ours, they knew practically everything. Discovery in quantum physics. That's the heritage we Indians have. Let's wake up to this and use it. Thank you.
Lesson to us that we need to go back to our roots and we need not to reinvent the wheel. Having said that one, still I think there are so many dimensions to the lecture that we may like to ask by our own queries and questions. He may have sensitized our own minds and hearts to get more of the questions from us. So just give me a minute so that I can get it working.
To understand this. And I'm very happy at the last you said that we are just rediscovering. This is going all through my mind. My first question is of course to myself, but I'm seeking an answer, it might come from you, that if we are rediscovering this, if everything is based in Vedanta, and I'm an ardent follower of Yogananda Paramahansaji, so why to study quantum physics? There's no need of proving God if we can feel God. So if we can feel God by practicing what is mentioned in Vedanta, so why should we study quantum physics? If it's a theoretical method of just proving God, there's no logic in proving God. We should feel God. That's my first query. My second query, because it is connected to this, we've heard a very enlightening lecture on quantum physics, how it's very enlightening. But the last thing which you said, I would like to hear some example from you. What can be a practical day-to-day technique or method where quantum physics can be helpful to us, which does not require 30 to 40 years of meditation? That is the second. Thank you, sir.
Okay, let's start with the second question. Let's start with the second question. The first question really is more of a theoretical confusion, not that important. You know, God can be a very misunderstood phenomenon because of various ways that people look at the word God. This is why I don't mention God very much anymore. I used to. I myself like the idea of God, but the Hindu sense of God is very different from the Christian sense of God. And this Christian sense of God is very misleading. And so it is difficult to talk about God because which God are you talking about? But let's talk about this everyday application of quantum physics. This is very, very important. As I said, the most important thing about the living beings in general, and especially human beings, is that we need creativity every day. It's not just, isolated events of creative experiences. We really need a balance between creativity and conditioning to maintain health. In other words, look at it from the hardware and software point of view. Software enables the hardware to carry out functions. So the model that we have of life is that every organ is carrying out its specific functions, and for the organ to carry out the specific function, the software has to guide the organs. And software does a very simple thing here, very easy to understand. The organ's functions depends on the proteins the organ is able to make. The proteins they are making is very complex. It's already codified in the genes. So genes make the proteins. But the problem is that all the cells in the body have the same genes. How does a gene know, a specific gene belonging to an organ, to make those specific proteins that is required for the organ function? So this problem is solved by recognizing that there has to be a software. The software tells the genes which ones to activate and which ones should remain dormant, right? But then again, the problem of the software. How does the software know? Eventual knower is essential. So it's consciousness which is the knower, and consciousness that cannot directly connect to matter. It connects through an intermediary. That's what we call the vital body. And movement of the vital body is called prana, right? So here is then the problem, that every day we encounter changes. The same software, if it were literally the same, could not give us optimum functioning in every situation that we encounter every day. Every day, as Ayurveda recognizes, every day, depending on the time of the day, Chandigarh is a very good example. Last night was so cold. In the day, I became equipped with a big coat, thinking that it will be cold, and it was fine. I could have done just with one coat. In one day, the temperature changes so much. How do you think the software would be if it was static? Software needs adjustment too. How does the software make adjustment? Because of the vital software that helps the physical software to make the adjustment necessary with the temperature. This is recognized in Ayurveda. So Ayurveda says the diet in the evening must be different from the diet in the morning. It is not just arbitrary that we start the morning diet in a certain way all over the world. There is similarity. You notice, we don't eat stuff that we eat later. We don't eat that in the morning. There's good reason for it. Okay? So this is the way that every day, every moment practically, we are using quantum science, if properly understood. Another example is, of course, your mind. If you did not come here, then you would not be thinking about consciousness, quantum physics today, right? But you were here and you are hearing it, and your mind is agile, it's creative, it's asking questions. Where did this question coming from? Would this question come from if you didn't come? No, it would not come from the brain. Brain would not think of it. It's the brain plus the inspiration you felt from the lecture that is causing the difference, right? And so in every day, we also in the process of the meditation, we encounter creativity. These are not isolated things. We do not live in an isolated manner, and so isolated machine, this concept of independent, separate machines operating in isolated ways, is totally false. Machines live in a connected way, in an environment which is not quite dependent on the machines. They cannot control it, and therefore these unforeseen things have to be built into the machines to be able to engage in new possibilities and experience them moment to moment even. And therefore we need quantum physics every day, every moment. Okay? Thank you.
So in the question that I also got my answer that how 30, 40 years we can do it one day. So he said that we are connected one, it's a progressive journey, right? So this is what I also have transferred. So we have got more hands. I think you have, sir.
Sir, I wanted to know how to teach quantum consciousness to a class 10 or class 6 kids.
What can I say? I once went to teach a class 8, I think, in America. And I was not getting anywhere. And then finally I made a statement that got the attention of the students. I said something like, atoms are so stable that in the course of ordinary interactions, they cannot change. Only very high energies are required to change. So in a sense, in the affairs of ordinary events on the earth, atoms do not die. And somehow the students got finally something they could relate to. And they started sloganing, atoms don't die, atoms don't die. I'll never forget that. What I'm trying to say is it's very hard. It's very hard to introduce quantum concepts to today's 6th graders or 8th graders, because by that time they already have developed a very constricted scientific materialist attitude. And until their logical framework itself brings up questions of meaning and purpose, this framework remains. why do you think it is so hard to change the worldview? This is true of people in general, even more so in the West than in India. In India, after all, there is the Upanishad, there is the Bhagavad Gita, and many parents at least make their children aware that, look, we came from this culture which was great at one time. So in Indian mind, there is a little softness towards consciousness. In the Western mind, it is even harder. But the challenge will be met by people who are into education. There is one person who is already teaching something. Where are you? There you are. Yeah, so you have to develop ideas of how to teach. Because, you know, I basically am a researcher, and scientists never have dealt with really young kids. When I had young kids, I was not this way. I was a materialist scientist. So, but you know, educationists have to come together. They have to develop ways that sixth graders, and of course parents. If proper parenting can happen, then I think this fossilization of the brain will not take place. If the brain is aware from the beginning that what the kid, the 2-year-old or the 3-year-old is experiencing, that unity of the world, they do experience that a lot. Even today, I remember some of my childhood experiences of oneness. It's amazing how much of that remains a part of a 3-year-old, which is the minimum age that I can remember. I don't remember anything earlier. So if we could value that, if parents knew to value that, my parents knew a little bit, but they still could not give me the proper explanations or proper environment to live with that. But I think with more science and the change of the educational worldview that we teach in schools and colleges, the parents especially could bring that awareness to the child that what you are experiencing, this differentiation, as they call it in psychology, this is a superposition on that unity. It is essential because you have to bring a knowledge base in you, otherwise you won't be able to function in the world. But that is what your essential being is as well. Both are essential for your existence. I think if these ideas were taught from the beginning, then this difficulty of teaching the 6th grader or 10th grader that I experienced would disappear. At the moment as it stands, I can talk only to the middle-aged people with willingness to understand, because they are confronted with a worldview challenge, their life is changing and they don't know how to deal with it. Young people do come after 20 years of traveling all through the world. I must say that I am surprised by younger people coming all the time, but that's because IT, information technology, has created such a dumbed-down environment. There's no meaning in life anymore. They are feeling so strongly the absence of meaning, especially in the West, that they are coming to quantum physics also. And then because they have the desire to know, that's what enables them to understand quantum physics. Quantum physics is impossible to make sense of if your mind is already made up and if you think that you know everything. No way that you can generate the idea that there are possibilities beyond what you know, that you don't know. This idea of you don't know is very difficult to generate in a person who knows everything. And I was such a person, so I know how difficult I was for me to get into this new wisdom. Very good question. Stay with it.
Very good question, as well as I think the educators are very difficult to stop from talking on that one because this is the area that is very closer to my heart. We will be discussing further on that one. So we are going to have, sir, another question from.
Good morning, sir. It is really an enlightening session and I really got a lot of insight. Sir, as a working psychologist...
Could you speak a little bit slower? I'm having difficulty in hearing you.
Sir, being a psychologist, it is so difficult to do a cognitive behavior therapy and recondition and change the cognition as we we were talking about. I just want your take on it. And as we see nowadays, children are suffering from a lot of disorders, depression, anxiety. How do we work with them, and how do we relate quantum physics with a therapy session?
It is so essential to bring the parents into the discussion of children's health, because mental health especially. You know, the children are born with this enormous cognitive difficulty because their consciousness just is basically created from that oneness, and differentiation is just so hard in that state of oneness. I have been a few times in that state of oneness, and the world just, it seems so one, and it takes a while to come back and accept the separateness. So there is a basic cognitive difficulty already. And then that cognitive difficulty is augmented by the way the world around you behaves. The developmental psychology that has developed in the West, except for the development of the physical aspects that Piaget did, some of that is relevant. But rest of the developmental schema is totally wrong and has to be completely revised. I need the help of psychologists for it. Gradually it's happening, but we really need to develop a good developmental psychological schema. That is not the one that we are employing today. So today, the kids that you will be getting will all suffer from huge amounts of what I call trauma. Because look at this, these cognitive difficulties are so different between how the parent sees the world and the child sees the world, that unless the parent is knowledgeable about the quantum science and how it really works, they won't be able to be sensitive to the child. I remember some of the problems that I myself had, that my parents, who were actually quite spiritual, even so, their behavior was not completely conducive to spirituality, in the sense that they had, treated people very differently, and to my child's eye, they caused what amounts to trauma. Because on one hand, I believed them, loved them, and so forth, and then I saw their behavior, which is so inconsistent with what they taught me some of the time. These things are unbearable to a child, The children are very sensitive. When somebody is teaching you about oneness of everyone, and that same person is treating another person badly, a child sees that. A child sees that as a violation of reality. The sensitivity is so different, no? Because the child knows the oneness at a certain place. The child has that oneness self in him, in her. And the child's God is his mother or her mother. And the mother is behaving not according to how the child feels, but according to some world the child does not understand. What is the difference if there is oneness and the child feels that the oneness is correct, and yet the behavior is so much contrary to the rules of oneness? So we really have created a world in which growing up as a child produces constant cognitive dissonance. And this constant cognitive dissonance creates a whole bunch of trauma, because this you know very well, the hippocampus is not developed so quickly, and therefore the child has no way of sequencing these events in the early growing up later, and therefore child becomes very sensitive to fragments of these memories, and then suffer from this cognitive dissonance even later on in the life, but not know what is causing the cognitive dissonance. This is the psychological condition of the people that you have to deal with. And this is what makes it so hard. Add to that reincarnation, and then it becomes even harder. We really need very good psychologists who are interested in the how to grow a good child, how to grow a healthy child question, and then work with quantum science.
Enlightening session, and I really got a lot of insight. Sir, as a working psychologist.
Could you speak a little bit slower? I'm having difficulty in hearing you.
Sir, being a psychologist, it is so difficult to do a cognitive behavior therapy and recondition and change the cognition as we were talking about. I just want your take on it. And as we see nowadays, children are suffering from a lot of disorders, depression, anxiety. How do we work with them, and how do we relate quantum physics with therapy sessions?
It is so essential to bring the parents.
This is a subject which I think bothers a lot of people, and so I'm working with some of the school people to toy around with the new ideas based on Dr. Goswami's teachings of how to apply it in a situation of children-related issues, small children, school-going children. So actually, there's a school in Mumbai which has been trying some very innovative things with a lot of success, and in fact, so I also provide some consulting support to them. So in fact, in most of the things, what I have seen is that if you really want to deal with a situation related to a child, the people to work with are the parents and the teachers. So actually this school has been trying some very innovative things on working on relationship between the parents and the teachers. And it has in effect brought about a lot of change in the children. And they have been, also children respond very well to group activities. Like in a classroom, they have introduced this concept of forgiveness meditation for children. Not specifically pointing out any child, but generally doing it as a group. And they find a lot of very interesting outcomes. So there are these ideas that directly you cannot be giving this knowledge to a child and it will not make sense to him. But we have to deal with it in this. Maybe this might be something useful for.
What a perspective on that one. What a perspective. One last question we will be taking now from onward. Just one thing. What a perspective of life. What I am taking from this one, most of the diseases, that one of the prime concern of today's conference is health. Most of our diseases are coming from the conflicts from within. Like what is the conflict? We live something. We want to live something. We preach others to live something. So this is how I think that is coming the basic of the quantum energy, that we need to be one with that energy. What exactly is our need? I think that is one of the things that I have taken from this lecture. One last question we are going to take now. Just one last question. Sorry, I have to ask, who is the mirror sitting there? I am taking that question.
It's fine. We can have more discussions over tea.
I'm very thankful to you for this talk because it has already put me in that deep thought process. Some time back I had read somewhere that our brain functions in such a way that only 2% of our brain is actually working on a day-to-day working level. And rest 2 to 3% is a subconscious level which we don't understand much, that's in dream level and so. A large portion of it is still in the unconscious level.
I'm not hearing you very well. Lift the microphone a little, yeah.
Yeah, the brain functioning I was talking about is such, I had read it somewhere, that only 2% of it is used for functional working level. The rest, 2 to 3%, is at subconscious level, which we don't understand, which is dreams and something like that, we don't get into that. The larger portion of it, which is about 60 to 70% of the brain, which is at the unconscious level, is sort of an unexplored and we don't understand it, what it is and how to reach there, how to make most of it. And then yet another thing is there, that there's a collective consciousness, which is a larger, last part of it, which may be another 4, 5% or 6%. It's where I had read it somewhere. In view of this quantum science, can we have this more of exploration done of our brain, the way it's functioning, and how maximum we can use it?
I think the question of the brain is a very good one, and it is true that we call some of the brain functioning, especially the functioning of the midbrain. Neocortex people pretend that they understand some of it, but of course the understanding is based on one very faulty idea that brain can cognize, brain cannot cognize. Cognize is to give meaning to what is happening, namely possibilities, and giving meaning is not possible for a machine. So brain cannot give meaning, it requires consciousness to give meaning. But aside from that, then the midbrain is left totally as unconscious brain activities. So this question of unconscious brain activities is the first one that we of course have to question, because there is no activity in the unconscious. There is no experience in the unconscious. There is no actualization of the possibilities in the unconscious.
The thing that I have taken from this lecture. One last question we are going to take now. Just one last question. Sorry, I have to ask, who is the nearer sitting there? I am taking that question.
We can have more discussions over tea.
I'm very thankful to you for this talk because it has already put me in that deep thought process. Some time back I had read somewhere that our brain functions in such a way that only 2% of our brain is actually working for a day-to-day working level. And rest 2 to 3% is a subconscious level which we don't understand much, it's in dream level and so on. A large portion of it is still in the unconscious
I'm
level.
not hearing you very well. Lift the microphone a little, yeah.
Yeah, the brain functioning I was talking about is such, I had read it somewhere, that only 2% of it is used for functional working level. The rest, 2 to 3%, is at subconscious level, which we don't understand, which is dreams and something like that. We don't get into that. The larger portion of it, which is about 60 to 70% of the brain, which is at the unconscious level, is sort of an unexplored, and we don't understand it, what it is and how to reach there, how to make most of it. And then yet another thing is there, that there's a collective consciousness, which is a last part of it, which may be another 4, 5% or 6%. It's where I had read it somewhere. In view of this quantum science, can we have this more of exploration done of our brain, the way it's functioning, and how maximum we can use it?
I think the question of the brain is a very good one, and it is true that we call some of the brain functioning, especially the functioning of the midbrain. Neocortex people pretend that they understand some of it, but of course the understanding is based on one very faulty idea that brain can cognize, brain cannot cognize. Cognize is to give meaning to what is happening, namely possibilities, and giving meaning is not possible for a machine. So brain cannot give meaning, it requires consciousness to give meaning. But aside from that, then the midbrain is left totally as unconscious brain activities. So this question of unconscious brain activities is the first one that we of course have to question, because there is no activity in the unconscious. There is no experience in the unconscious. There is no actualization of the possibilities in the unconscious. Unconscious in quantum physics is very clear. It's unmanifest possibilities. Possibilities that have not been observed, that have not been experienced by an observer. Okay? So the first thing that got to go is this large amount of the midbrain activities, which we say is coming to us an instinctual brain circuits, mostly negative, but there is also the pleasure circuits which brings us some positive experiences. That part can be easily dealt with by proposing, and this is completely in agreement also with what we know about animals, mammals, that there is a self in the midbrain. There is an experiencing self, and they are not completely unconscious, except that the neocortical self takes over the functioning as soon as we become capable of thinking. Neocortex, the function is thinking. That much is very clear. It takes the prefrontal cortex to think. And the midbrain is mostly about feelings. I mean, it is about feelings, and then neocortex keeps thinking to the feeling, and so we call them emotion, which is a mixture of thinking and feeling. So when you begin to understand this way, then the large part of your question is already answered. And the rest of the question is, when we say that we don't use so much of the brain, what we really mean is potentialities of the brain. We don't really mean as the brain is actual. Actually, the brain parts, the different compartments of the brain, cognitive scientists have done a pretty good job, especially with neuroscience's help, pretty good job of understanding the different cognitive functions of the different parts of the brain. One difficulty is, of course, they are not recognizing feeling as the cognitive function, because there is no way you can give a model of feeling in the materialist model, so they generally leave feeling out. In the quantum model, feeling is feeling of vital energy, so we can make a model of feeling. And I forgot to mention the last piece of experimental data that I wanted to mention, which is the biophoton. You know, the big part, very big good news, enormous good news for us alternative developers of paradigms of science, is that there is not only the biochemical body, but there is also a bioelectric body. And this bioelectric body gives us a measurement device for this vital body. So vital body, of course, cannot be measured physically, has been the wisdom, but because the vital body has a built-in measurement apparatus, bioelectric field that surrounds our skin. And so any fluctuations in our vital body, which we feel as mood swing, will have an effect on this bioelectric field, and that effect will produce a changing field, and any changing electric field, of course, emits photons, and these are called biophotons. How are they different? They are PowerPoint on it, showing these pictures. I mean, they're just such demonstration of a difference of biophoton emission from a sage and if you live a mundane life, or a quantum activist and a mundane life giver. And that it will convince anybody that the quantum living is way superior, way better, way more conducive to expansion of consciousness, which brings us happiness. Okay?
Thank you very much. I think we can hear some enchants now in the environment. Somebody's calling all of us. Somebody's calling all of us. I think that's Steve. So we now would be. Can you say?
We just honor Goswami sir. Thank you sir for that wonderful lecture. I know there's so many things. Frankly, मुझे भी सारा कुछ नहीं समझ में आया. Let's admit it. Isn't it?
So it was too vast because his answers have raised so many questions further. Because the subject is very deep and the purpose was to sensitize but there is lot more to come. You know, after this lecture we are having a tea break now and Anil Sinha's lecture where he would be giving some practical applications of what quantum science has to offer. And its applications in the field of agriculture and medicine and business, so that he would be covering. And of course our team would be covering lot more things which we are actually applying in our clinic. How this is, and myself, Dr. Shaveta, Nimrit, and then we are waiting for a very deep meditation also, which would again be a very good practical experience.
And just to say कि Anurag ji asked a question regarding learning theory versus practical. So to give an example, what Paramahansa Yogananda also has written in his one of his lectures, that up, suppose I want to tell you कि orange कैसे taste होता है उसका, right? So there is an example, you remember? So आप उसकी कितनी मर्जी theory पढ़ लो, right? कितनी varieties हैं orange की, दुनिया के किस किस देश में orange होता है, कौन से cities में होता है, उसमें कौन सा molecule है जिसका वो हमें हमारे taste buds कहाँ से उसके sense उसको taste को perceive करते हैं ना, but उससे better है orange को taste करना. That is a simple thing. Taste the orange and you will come to know all the theory of. So to know God is to अपनी consciousness को raise करना है, and that of course meditation is one of the biggest tool. And understanding brain के pathways, कहाँ पे क्या हो रहा है, कैसे brain function कर रहा है, कैसे subconscious mind होता है, superconscious होता है, उससे easy है love, forgiveness, gratitude. So these are simple tools which our rishis, our saints, they have all told us. So love, forgiveness, gratitude would help reaching there, which all the immense theory and everything may not lead us to there. But practicing the simple techniques of love, forgiveness, gratitude, and of course meditation, introspection, this would help us to be there. So let's honor Goswami sir, and I'll request Arun ji. Yeah, Rakesh ji, Pujjo, Nimrit, madam.
Ask the question.
Please come on stage and. So this is Bhagavad Gita by Paramahansa Yogananda, which we are gifting to Goswami sir. So this is again the essence which has been, I'm sure he must have read this, but
Sir.
Thank you, sir.